President Volodymyr Zelensky of I almost said Israel, of Ukraine, is issuing a dire warning and saying that the war is in danger of being lost, and then sends a broadside against much of Western Europe and the United States, really complaining about that he's being treated unfairly. We're going to dive into that today, and we have probably our most favorite guest on this show, and honored to have Colonel Doug Macgregor again, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, great combat vet, and just all around smart guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Sure.
Well, look, let's just dive right in here, because this is a lot of strange stuff here, and actually we're going to have throughout the show a number of what is really kind of seems odd to me, statements by people that are devoid of the logic that should undergird an argument. And we're going to be asking you to expose a lot of that and tell us what actually is going on with it. And let's start first with Zelensky. So now, first of all, he's been complaining about, a lack of support, and always going back to this issue of the U.S. Congress not giving the money. We're going to get into that in some detail shortly. But he's been particularly miffed of late because he saw what happened in Israel and says, hey, man, y'all went down there, guns ablazing in the U.S. and France and Jordan and all these people going to help Israel. Where's mine? Kind of thing. Here's what he said, first of all, right before that happened, about his complaints about where's my Patriot missiles.
Russian terror is only possible now because we don't have enough modern air defense systems. In other words, frankly, because our partners lack the political will to provide them. They all know exactly what is required and who can make life-saving decisions.
So first of all, he's like, where's my damn missiles? Because it's just like you're cowards for not giving me what I'm telling you I want. And then after the Israeli strike, he added this level.
The whole world saw that Israel was not alone in this defense. Do you think that the same message is being sent to the world about Ukraine?
I will give you one example, a very simple example. The Tripilska power plant. Electricity in the Kyiv region depends on it. 11 missiles were headed towards it. The first 7 we took down. 4 destroyed Tripilska. Why? Because we had 0 missiles. We ran out of all missiles. When someone says that our allies cannot provide us with this or that weapon, or they cannot be in Ukraine with this or that force because that would be perceived as if Ukraine is engaging NATO in the war, well, after yesterday's attack, I want to ask you a question. Is Israel part of NATO or not? Here is the answer. Israel is not a NATO country. The NATO allies, including NATO countries, have been defending Israel. They showed the Iranian forces that Israel was not alone. And this is a lesson. This is a response to anyone on any continent who says you need to assist Ukraine very carefully so you don't engage NATO countries in the war.
So I think there's this little thing of Iran not having 6,000 nuclear weapons in a nuclear triad might have something to do with the level of risk we were being willing to take there. But what do you say when you hear Zelensky making those statements?
Well, these are expressions of desperation, Dan. He's on his final lap, if you will, and he has very little probability of succeeding at anything he does. Even if he had more air defense missiles, I doubt seriously they would make much difference, because most of the batteries that are available to launch them have been destroyed or inoperable. The war is for all intents and purposes over in Ukraine. People have begun to come to that realization, and obviously nobody wants to drill a dry hole. On the other hand, it was always clear that once Israel became embroiled in any conflict of any kind, that for a whole range of reasons that are less strategic and more emotional and more financial, we would become desperately committed to Israel. And he's complaining about it, but he should have been well aware that would happen.
And one has to wonder, I mean, really, I think this speaks to the desperation issue you talk about there, because that's not going to work. That to go and publicly basically condemn all these Western leaders who've given, thousands and thousands of artillery or military vehicles and millions of shells, but it's like, hey, where's the rest of it? And why'd you do it for him and not for me? That's not going to make Macron or Biden, anybody go, oh yeah, okay, all right, well, let's give you the weapon. So I think he's really, overplaying his hand, and it's only working against him, I think.
Well, at this point, it really doesn't make any difference. But the bottom line is he also wants to avoid taking the blame for the failure that's imminent. But he deserves a lot of the blame because he's the one that sent hundreds of thousands of his soldiers to the death. He's the one who insisted on attacking when others said don't. He's the one that is responsible for the destruction of his country. In fact, the only thing he's done is destroy everything. So I don't think he has a leg to stand on, and I think it's over. But until the Russians close up on the Dnieper River and then make a decision whether or not they're going to cross and seize Odessa, I still think they will. I think people are just going to turn a blind eye and walk away. By the time anybody pays attention to it again, Kharkov will certainly be in Russian hands, and I think the Russians will be preparing to move down to Odessa.
Speaking of coming to an end, one of the things that's been talked about with a little bit more, I guess, frequency here of late is, what about some negotiations? Maybe we should negotiate. And of course, that gets immediately turned off by some. But back in, and I want to show you something that Zelensky said in terms of negotiations just a couple of days ago. But first of all, just to kind of remind people, during his interview with Tucker Carlson, Vladimir Putin addressed this issue.
Do the United States need this? What for? Thousands of miles away from your national territory. Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with the national debt, more than $33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine? Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia? Make an agreement, already understanding the situation that is developing today?
February, when Putin is saying again, and he went to a little bit more length elsewhere in that conversation about that he's willing to negotiate. He talked about the failed March 2022 opportunity where the war could have come to an end then. But then despite all that, you have Zelensky saying this.
Well, there are two words that are never mentioned anymore inside the Beltway. One is debt, and the other is diplomacy. The two D words. Those are absolutely banned from political discussions. And there's a simple reason why. Both are embarrassing and both are humiliating. We can't negotiate with the Russians. All we can do is show up, have a discussion, drink some coffee, and then sign on the dotted line. Russia is in the driver's seat. The opportunity for negotiation has long since passed. Now, I'm sure that Mr. Putin would like us to sign something that ultimately puts an end to the fighting, but we're not going to do that. It's too humiliating. I mean, how can you retreat from obviously stupid statements on policy the way we have made them and then expect anything good to happen? We talked about removing Putin from power. We talked about stripping Russia of its resources. We've talked about the destruction of the Russian state. And then we've lied prolifically day in and day out about how many Russians have been killed, and how the Russians can't provide enough ammunition or running out of rockets, missiles, and so forth, can't do anything right, on and on and on. How do you retreat from all of that and say, oh, I guess we were wrong. Please, let's sign off on this document that says you get to keep what you've got. I don't see it happening. So,
well, and to your point, Zelensky seems to be on that sheet of music because here's how he views it.
If you don't start to negotiate now, won't conditions just get worse?
I'm ready to negotiate now with you or with such people who really want peace. You understand?
Not with Russia.
But he doesn't want, especially Putin, all their narratives, the documents from our intelligence, what they discuss about. We have it from our intelligence. We have it from the United States. They know everything the same. So we understand that he's not ready for any negotiations. He doesn't want. He's not interested. For him, this is not victory. He needs victory. And for him, victory is to destroy Ukraine.
So he's partially right there that Putin is not interested, as you really just said yourself, in a negotiation, but he is willing to negotiate an end to the war itself and to stop fighting as opposed to only going in via victory. but Zelensky or the West, for the reasons you just pointed out, I think aren't willing to do that. But then we have to look at that. What that means is that will condemn possibly hundreds of thousands of more Ukrainian men to death, and more cities lost and more territory lost.
Well, I think we are watching the Ukrainian army collapse. It's been underway for some time now. What was initially a mild spring rain is turning into a flood when it comes to this. As it becomes increasingly clear there's nothing left with which to fight, and that Ukraine is totally prostrate, then I suppose Zelensky will climb into an aircraft and leave. Otherwise, I think he stands an excellent chance of ending up in front of a firing squad, probably sponsored by his own people. This is a tragedy that we've helped to bring on. It's embarrassing, it's humiliating, but look, it's game, set, match for Russia. That's the bottom line.
Yeah,
they want it. They're going to determine what it looks like afterwards. And pretty soon, I think you're going to see the Poles, the Hungarians, the Romanians, and others who are going to step forward and say, all right, you've won. Oh, by the way, we have territory that we're interested in, populations that we're interested in. There are Hungarians living on Ukrainian soil. I think the Hungarians would like to liberate them from that unfortunate outcome. I wouldn't be surprised if the Poles have some interest in that. And frankly, if you're sitting in Moscow as President Putin, what difference does it make to you? The one thing you don't want is a Western Ukraine that is part of NATO. In other words, it can't be a launching pad anymore. I don't think there's going to be much appetite for any of that, because I don't think NATO itself is going to be very meaningful in the near term. After all, NATO has failed. Washington has failed. Everything they've done has failed. And I don't know how many billions of dollars have disappeared into this black hole. Certainly a lot more than we've given Israel within the last few years. But the bottom line, it hasn't worked. It's over. Yeah. It's done. And I think the people in charge are going to recognize that one way or the other.
And Ambassador Chaz Freeman actually put a finer point on that when in a speech he gave a couple of days ago, I think, where he talks about there's three options. He says 3 ways to end this war, and the third one is the one that's the most likely. But check out how he put it.
We can continue to support Ukraine as Russia grinds it to bits and reduces it further in size and population. We can escalate the war, as French President Emmanuel Macron has advocated, despite the Russian threat to answer this with counter-escalation, possibly to the nuclear level. Or we can face up to failure and save what we can of Ukraine by negotiating with Russia.
So that's what we can never do. Face up to failure and acknowledge it just didn't work. That's why we had the collapse in Afghanistan in August of 2021 after 2 years, because we never acknowledged it. But I think it's starting to look like, and you said this a second ago, we're getting into that territory again where the president of Afghanistan took off with a bunch of cash, the government fell apart, the military fell apart, and the Taliban won. I mean, do you see something like that happening again?
Well, I think someone else is going to step into the vacuum. I don't know who that person is, whether that person is someone that already knows the Russian government. There are some Ukrainians that could step in. But the first thing that has to happen is Zelensky and his little band of comedians need to leave Kiev. They need to go away. I think that will happen. When that happens, then all bets are off. So everything can change. But again, Chaz Freeman put it very, very well. It's over, and we're not going to face this failure. And I've said for a long time, what did we do when it became abundantly clear that Vietnam was lost? We left. We just left. Did we ever stand up and say we failed? Did we ever acknowledge the folly of what we did? No, we didn't talk about it. The media went silent. Everyone shifted their attention. I think that's what's going to happen probably this summer.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we had Ambassador Freeman on yesterday, and that's exactly what he said too. He has the same feeling that this summer is going to see an end game. One thing I want to talk about here before we change topics is this whole issue that's still roiling a lot of Congress, and that is this aid package for Ukraine. Now, apparently, it's already been whittled down from 60 to 47 billion, but it has some interesting provisions of it. But here's an interesting thing about it. As this New York Times article here shows, there's the primary reason why Ukraine's fallen apart. Gary, if you could bring that this one here, they're running low of ammunition, soldiers, and air defense capacity. And I mean, literally, they're running out. Zelensky himself said that earlier, that they had this huge energy facility destroyed because they didn't have enough missiles. And now then that's starting to be endemic across everywhere. But you have people like Richard Haass of the CF Council on Foreign Relations is saying, all we need is this money coming in from Congress, and somehow that's going to be reversed. Here's how he put it.
I don't much care whether it's a combined bill or a separate bill, so long as the aid for Ukraine passes. That's the most pressing of all of that.
Right.
And every day the battlefield news, Joe, is awful strategically, but also in human terms. The idea that you have these soldiers on the front lines who simply maybe have a half dozen shells and they have to parcel them out to get through a day. You can't fight a war that way, and it's tilting in Russia's favor. This is recklessness and irresponsibility on steroids that we've ever reached this point. I'm hoping, and again, to me, it doesn't matter so much whether it's loans or grants. Just get Ukraine the military aid.
But Doug, here's the reality. No one's talking about where that $47 billion is going or what it can buy. But check this out. This has been released by the Congress, I think by the Speaker's office, that of this $48 billion, I guess it is, most of it is going to replenish DoD stocks. Another big chunk is going to go to DoD and EUCOM AOR, not even to Ukraine, and only $13.8 billion is actually going in to provide drawdown capabilities. And I don't even know where they're going to get a lot of artillery shells anyway. So it's minuscule, even if it gets. And how is it that so many people like Richard Haass, who's supposed to be one of the premier foreign policy, minds these days and has been for many, many years, doesn't understand that won't make any difference militarily once that's passed?
I suspected Richard Haass knows that. He's simply part of the inside group in Washington that wants to conceal and cover its shame and humiliation. How do you do that? You paper it over with money, with aid, and you say, well, we did all we could. And unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. The truth is, wars end in any number of different ways, but more often than not in history, they've ended when the force that was fighting on one side couldn't fight anymore. That's where we are right now with the Ukrainians. Even one of the most neo-Nazi formations within the last 48 hours simply refused to attack. They didn't want to surrender, but they said, we're not attacking anymore because they can't. If they try to, they'll be decimated. That's where we are. And then the rest of the Ukrainians are more sober-minded, have said, I've had it. And the Russians have done an excellent job of reassuring people, if you surrender, you're not going to be mistreated. And the Ukrainians know that. So they're going over, they're getting fed, their wounds are being tended to, and eventually they'll be repatriated sooner rather than later. This is over, and Haass is obviously dead wrong, but he's part of the cover and conceal crowd in Washington, D.C.
And last question on this subject here. How do you see this playing out? As you kind of touched on it earlier, but what do you see the aftermath of this? Because NATO put its credibility on the line, the United States, Great Britain, all on, we can't let Russia win. We have to make sure Ukraine wins, and that's not going to happen. So what happens when the fiction can't be papered over anymore and Putin ends up in a much stronger position than when he started? How does that affect Western Europe?
I think that NATO in particular will sort of gradually sink beneath the waves, as we say at sea. It's like a giant battleship that's not moving anymore. It lacks the ability to fight very effectively, and people are going to start getting off the battleship. I think that's where we're headed, and the Europeans are going to desert the sinking ship, and eventually it'll just sink beneath the waves, and by the time it does, the cameras will be turned off and the subject will be changed and no one will bring it up anymore. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. I back in January of 2022, I was talking to Dimitri Simes at the National Interest, and I predicted then that NATO would not survive this crisis. It's not going to survive. I mean, why, if you're living in Europe and you understand what has now happened in Ukraine, would you saddle up with the United States? That's why it's so incredibly stupid of the Finns and the Swedes in particular to join this dying organization. It's not going to work. So we're at the end. And as I said, we'll change the subject. There will be no formal flag withdrawal or anything else. It'll just all vanish. What did Henry James say? Sacred cows are never slain. They simply vanish. That's what will happen to NATO.
You know, it's so perverse, Doug, and so discouraging because if we had made that deal in Istanbul in April of 2022, or even when General Milley in November of 2022 said this is the time to negotiate when Russia was at its weakest point. They had just lost Kherson City and in the Kharkiv area. If you had ended the war then I think that it would have been a lot better certainly would have been better for Ukraine, that thousands of people would still be alive, tens of thousands. But it would even been better, but probably only put on life support the remainder of NATO. But because we were unwilling to do any of those things then, now I think that you're right. History is going to show that this was the beginning of the death of NATO.
But you're pointing to something that a lot of people simply don't understand. The last consideration was the welfare and the interests of the Ukrainian people. No one gave a damn about the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were simply useful tools. We turned the place into a battering ram, and we thought that we could bring Russia down by doing so. It was always impossible. It made no sense. Now we've got at least, 1 million, maybe 2 million Ukrainian casualties, at least 500,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. I don't know how many others have died of wounds or what damage has been done to the civilian population. The point is the nation is dead. 14 million Ukrainians are no longer living in the country, and no one cares. I hear no expressions of interest in humanity.
Yeah.
What is happening to the people that live there? The only person who's ever expressed any interest in that is President Putin. And he has been very clear that he doesn't want to kill large numbers of these Orthodox Christian Slavs. On the contrary, he is concerned about the people. He views Ukraine as, just as Belarusia, as component parts of the greater Slavic nation in Eastern Europe called Russia. So he's the only one that seems to be remotely concerned about any of it. And of course, no one in Washington will ever admit that.
They won't admit the obvious, and Zelensky obviously doesn't because he continues to have the fiction. But anyway, I don't want to beat a dead horse there. Want to shift gears a little bit to the other war that's raging in. And you just had a piece in the American Conservative. Would Israel go nuclear against Iran? Very provocative title here. And I think very few people even have that on their radar still. So I was really interested in having you on today to talk a little bit more about this. So first of all, I wonder if you can just kind of tell me what prompted you to write this now, and what do you think is the risk of this?
I think it's very important for people in the United States to understand that the possession of nuclear weapons and the capability to deliver nuclear warheads, which is what Israel has, represents Israel's asymmetric strategic advantage. No one else in the region can do what they can do. No one else in the region has built the warheads that can be mounted on missiles or aircraft and delivered quickly, but the Israelis. The Israelis have always been quietly pointing to this capability in any discussions with any of their neighbors. All of the neighbors know that they have this capability. In fact, Erdogan made the point in Turkish parliament a couple of months ago, don't waste your time threatening us with your weapons. We know what you have. We understand that. And you do not threaten us. Well, the truth is they do. And this is considered a critical component of this thing called deterrence, which the Israelis claim they lost on 7 October. Now, when I say claim they lost on 7 October, I mean claim they lost. I'm still not convinced that what happened on 7 October was real. I think some decisions were made that were very bad and precipitated this horrific event. No one has been able to convince me that Israeli intelligence missed everything that was happening inside Gaza. Perhaps at some point we'll find out the whole truth, and maybe some people will be hanged in Israel for having overlooked those things. But they continue to point to 7 October and say we have to regain deterrence. These people were audacious. They dared to challenge Israeli strategic dominance. They must be punished. Well, punishing them is something that undoubtedly has happened, at least in part, although they failed miserably in their attempts to eradicate Hamas. We know that. Hamas is existent. It's not dead. It hasn't gone away. At the same time, for reasons that make no sense to most of us, the Israelis suddenly struck this diplomatic structure, which the Israelis claim was really a safe house for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. It may well have been that, but it was still part of a diplomatic compound and a consulate. And they did that for one reason, to create the opportunity to expand the war, because they want to finish off their enemies. They're in the position of settling accounts, if you will. Think of this as the end of Godfather 1. You know, today we settle all the family's accounts. I think that's what Mr. Netanyahu wants to do. And we have now reached a turning point. And the turning point is the Iranians responded to what the Israelis did, but they did it in a way that signals unambiguously two things. First of all, they do not want a regional war, which they regard as destructive and pointless. And secondly, that they are approachable, that they're willing to talk. I mean, obviously, we've talked to them.
Yeah.
The other Arab states have talked to them. There's no reason why the Israelis can't talk to them. But we're dealing with an Israeli government that under no circumstances will talk to them. And this is the problem. So what the Israelis do now will determine whether or not there is a regional war in the Middle East. They can launch a modest response, or they can launch a dramatic one. If it's dramatic and it goes into Iran, in Iranian territory, and kills Iranians, then we get the regional war, because there's no reason for Iran to exercise any restraint at that point.
Well,
they
in
will
fact,
launch whatever they've got.
Yeah, to your point, here's what the Iranian foreign minister said yesterday.
If the Israeli regime makes a mistake, this time Iran's response, as Iran's military commanders announced, will not be minimal, but immediate and severe.
And in response, you have Daniel Hagari from the Israeli side throwing back his warnings as well.
Iran is the world's biggest state sponsor of terror. Its network of terror doesn't just threaten the people of Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. The regime in Iran fuels the war in Ukraine and beyond. Iran will bear the consequences for choosing to escalate the situation any further. Israel is on high alert. We have increased our readiness to protect Israel from further Iranian aggression. We are also prepared to respond. The Israel Defense Forces prepared for all scenarios, and we will take the necessary steps together with our allies to protect the people of Israel.
Now, here's one of my concerns, Doug, because a lot of people talk tough back and forth, and we'll see what actually happens, because I agree that the next issue is what will Netanyahu do? Because if his intention, as you suggest, was for April 1st, when he struck the embassy compound there to precipitate an excuse to allow them to hit into Iran and not lose the Western support, then so far, Iran did not play their role right when they had a response that didn't kill anyone in Israel. So it's making it a lot harder for him to go. But he's blown us off before, so he may do that. Here's the problem, though. And talk to me about this part here about the Iranian response, because many in the West have said, oh, this shows how weak they are, and we're going to show some of that here in a minute. But a deeper analysis shows that this was a restrained capability or response by Iran, and they could go much, much greater with some of these tens of thousands of drones overwhelming the Israeli air defense systems, its whole network, and they could cause a lot of harm to Israel, which is why I was worried about your article. Because if Israel gets to the point to where they think, holy crap, our Iron Dome has been depleted of interceptors and they have swarmed into it, now then the only thing left is a nuclear weapon to defend themselves. That's what I worry about. How do you see that?
Well, let's go back briefly to some of the things that the Israeli spokesman said. It was kind of entertaining to me. We're always talking about Iran as the principal state sponsor of terrorism, and that's a stretch. He also tried to connect Iran to the war in Ukraine, which I found interesting, because initially when the Russians went into Ukraine, large numbers of Jews in Israel were very delighted with it because they saw the Ukrainians in a very different light based on their own experiences during the Second World War in the 30s. And they also were aware of this neo-Nazi element. And so many Jews inside Ukraine said, whatever the Russians do is fine with us. All of a sudden now, Iran is encouraging Russia to go into Ukraine, and that makes them a terrorist state. You know, it's more of the same. The danger is as follows. The Iranians did what they did to signal not weakness, but a desire to avoid a regional war. They know that if there is a massive retaliation by the Israelis against them, that they are committed to essentially the same thing. When this begins, it'll be hard to stop. You'll have a regional war. They don't want a regional war. Secondly, they used a lot of old technology. Very, very few missiles were truly modern, and these were at the tactical or theater ballistic missile level. Some did get through, and the reason they got through was not just because the Israelis and their allies, the United States and Great Britain and France, had wasted munitions on second-rate and third-rate capabilities like these drones that fly very slowly and are easily tracked and shot down. It's also because I think the Iranians did not want to show what they can really do. They now have a nice picture of Israeli air defenses, radars, and so forth, although I'm sure they probably had most of that anyway. If the Israelis go after them with a vengeance, then everyone is going to be surprised at what the capabilities really are and what the Iranians can actually do. So this feigning weakness, if you will, or alleged weakness, is a mistake. We should, welcome the fact that nothing more serious happened and urge the Israelis to change their approach. But again, remember, Israel is losing the war in Gaza for all intents and purposes. They've turned into a global pariah for what they're doing there. And Hamas continues to survive and continues to launch attacks. So there's failure in Hamas. Now you're talking about a potential regional war that would involve Iran and undoubtedly would bring in Hezbollah. How this helps Israel is beyond my imagination. I don't see it helping Israel at all. I think it would be the death knell of the Israeli state, which is why I've been very critical of Netanyahu and these policies. I don't want to see Israel destroyed. I want to see it survive.
Exactly.
But of course, I hold a minority opinion there. And there are lots of people now that are anxious to go to war. Remember, Israel is a very small state. It's smaller than New Jersey. It doesn't have much strategic depth. That's one of the reasons that the Israelis would like to take over the West Bank and expand absolute total control all the way to the Jordan River. I understand the strategic issues and I understand the strategic needs. But the point is, we live in a different world today. This is not 1900. It's not 1945. It's not even 1990.
Yeah.
And you're dealing with nations that are far more sophisticated and technically competent than the Israelis think they are, and certainly more than we think they are.
Well, and
we're about to get an education if we're not careful.
Yeah, we don't give much evidence that we're going to be careful because, as you mentioned earlier and just a second ago again, about the cheerleaders who want to ignore everything you just said, all of the on-the-ground realities, the dynamics and stuff, the advancement of the capabilities. You have men like John Bolton saying this.
The last number I heard was 300 plus drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, and maybe 3 or 4 got through. So who's the fool in this posture right now? Who looks weak? The regime in Iran looks weak. And a way to pin that down is for Israel to go after Iran's nuclear weapons program, which I think it can destroy or disable in very substantial part, if not totally.
I wonder if you could just address that last part of Bolton's claim there, because it's so many are saying it, that all you got to do is just go in with a few missiles and bam, nuclear program over and Iran's put back in their box.
The Iranians have gone to great lengths to put their nuclear program underground. They are a nuclear threshold state. That means that they have enough enriched plutonium that if they set out to build warheads and mount them on their existing inventory of missiles, they can do it. Every intelligence organization that I'm aware of that's looked at this carefully has said they are not there yet. In other words, they haven't done it. but they are in a location with these capabilities that will be very difficult to reach. And that's why several people have suggested they may use nuclear weapons, even if they're just tactical nuclear weapons, 5 kiloton or less, in order to inflict real damage, because conventional bombs won't do the job. So that's one of the things that has worried me, and it's worried many people, because again, once you break that threshold and you employ a nuclear weapon of any kind, that legitimates the use of those weapons against you. Now, I don't know that the Iranians have any. I don't believe that. But that doesn't mean they couldn't acquire them. It doesn't mean that others in the region can't rapidly acquire them and then employ them against Israel. So, yes, I'm very concerned about that. I think it's a dumb idea to assume that Iran is a weak state just because it doesn't have a large ground force. Why would it? It doesn't need any territory. It's not bent on conquest. Everything the Iranians have done is to secure what they have and to help and secure fellow Shiites. That's what they've been about. And everyone acts as though that is unambiguous aggression against, God and the whole world. Well, that's just nonsense.
Yeah.
The bottom line is that if Iran is attacked, they will use what they have, and that's a very destructive arsenal. No one should underestimate. I know the Israelis know it very well, and they're quite aware of that arsenal, which is, again, why they would like to see us in the fight with them.
Yeah. And in fact, just yesterday, actually, on our show, we interviewed Ambassador Freeman to talk about that issue right there. And one of the statements that came out of, I think it was President Raisi but one of the senior officials of Iran said that if there is another attack on Iran territory, that they would come back not with 350 missiles and drones, but with 1,500 or more. Here's what Chaz said about it.
Israel had to mobilize all its forces, go on alert, panic the population, and draw on the full strength of the United States, United Kingdom, and the intelligence support of Arab countries whose territory these drones were crossing. You think we can, if it is 1,500 missiles next time, what is required to defend Israel against 1,500 missiles as opposed to 300 is beyond our capability.
And here's one of the weird things, Doug. Jack Keane he contradicts his whole argument when he talks about, because he's the other big cheerleader that always loves to go and attack Iran. But check out his rationale for attacking Iran, how he sets up his argument here. Watch this.
Iran has a very weak military. Air Force still flying U.S. Airplanes from the 1970s. Navy, very small, not a lot of capability. Land forces, poorly equipped, poorly trained, even though they have sufficient numbers. They resourced their rocket and missile force. That is where they put their money. And look what happened. That failed them as well. This is why I've always maintained that we can take advantage of Iran's vulnerability here by conducting limited measured attacks against the IRGC and these capabilities to force them to shut down their proxies. The Biden administration has never done it because why? They fear a, quote, wider war, unquote. When Iran can't fight a wider war. That's the reality of it, Stuart.
How can you sit there and diagram the weakness of Iran's ability to project power, say that they don't want a wider war, they can't fight one? Then why do you need to go in and take them out?
Yeah, well, he's a member of that group that has profited through enrichment for taking the positions he has. Let's be frank. He's going to sing that tune just like Bolton in perpetuity. It doesn't make any difference what the facts say. The truth is, Iran is not interested in territorial conquest or acquisition. It's not building forces to subdue or subjugate anybody anywhere. It's protecting itself and its co-religionists. That's all. Israel, on the other hand, wants to expand, and we understand why and the rationale for that. But they want to do it at the expense of humanity, of people, millions of people who are Arabs who happen to live there, whom they regard as animals and subhuman, but still qualify, in my judgment, as human beings and do not deserve to be murdered. That's the problem. They don't want to go there. They don't want to address that. The wider war helps them escape that discussion. At the same time, you've got the problem with the missile arsenal that is substantial, and the Israelis know it. They're well aware of the dangers of challenging it without us. So the notion that you can have limited, measured attacks by the United States is nonsense. That's not how we do business. If we try to start that way, we inevitably scale up and escalate because you have to. The Iranians, I think, are smarter, and if they are attacked in what we call limited or measured ways, I think they will throw off the constraints and they will unleash everything they've got on the assumption that if they don't, they may lose it. In which case, Israel will be in a lot of trouble. And I would hate to see that, because decades have been invested in that country to build up a very successful society. Why put it at risk unnecessarily? But right now, no one is thinking in those terms. You know, Thucydides said you go to war for essentially three reasons: fear, honor, or interest. Well, the Israelis have certain interests, but they don't necessarily conflict with Iran, in my judgment, to the extent that they think they do. But they do have interests. They want to expand their country. They are afraid. The Israelis have been afraid of what the Iranians can do for a long time, and I think fear has overcome any other inhibitions at this point. Honor is probably not terribly meaningful to Israel. I think, on the other hand, with Iran, they did what they thought their national honor required, but they don't want a regional war. They don't want a direct confrontation. If it's forced on them, they'll fight, and it will be destructive. And no one will profit from the outcome, neither we, nor the Israelis, nor anybody in the region, and certainly not Iran. Everyone will pay a price.
Right. Yeah. That's what motivates me. All this. There is zero possibility for an upside. Now, it almost appears that at least Biden has some recognition of some of this, because he at least publicly went out and said, if you go into offensively in Iran, we're not going to protect you. We're not going to participate with Israel. But my worry is that he then caveated that by saying, but we'll help you defend, meaning it sounds to me like if Israel on its own goes up and strikes anyway, and then Iran does strike back, that we're putting ourselves on the hook again to defend Iran. Ergo, it's like we're going to use the U.S. Navy and Air Force to give to the IDF and let them fight with them. And that to me is a big problem.
Well, first of all, I'm not confident that Mr. Biden is really in charge. I think he has handlers that move him from place to place, that hand him things to say, which he says. That doesn't mean that he's resistant to it. I think he's happy to comply and go along, but there are other figures behind the scenes wielding greater power. And as a result, the promise that we will not participate in an attack on Iran, I think, is hollow. And I'm afraid that we would inevitably be dragged in, which is why I don't think it should occur at all. But we're now at that stage where something is going to be done. When Passover ends, I suspect we're going to see, and that ends, I think, on Saturday, I think we will see a response from the Israelis, just as we saw something from Iran after Ramadan. I can't predict what it will be. Whatever it turns out to be will probably influence whether or not we have this regional war.
That is just hard to even hear that, because it's difficult for me to see any off ramp, given who's in charge, given who the players are in the U.S. and in Israel right now. It's hard for me to see anybody doing the rational thing. What should we do, though, Doug? If you can't predict what Israel's going to do, but what should the U.S. do right now, irrespective of what Tel Aviv does?
Well, you know, the Chinese and the Vietnamese have come very close to blows in recent years. Americans haven't followed it closely. They've had fights at sea with between fishing fleets. And at one point, there was so much anger towards China that the Vietnamese burned down factories that were owned by Chinese and then expelled the Chinese, literally threw all the Chinese out of Vietnam. So the Chinese that have disputes with the Vietnamese in the South China Sea have now sat down and they've negotiated, and they have a hotline that sits in, Ho Chi Minh City, in the capital, and then they have, or Hanoi, and then they have a phone in Beijing. This hotline system has been placed there to avoid a conflict. It doesn't settle outstanding issues, but it's a step in the direction of easing tensions and creating a rapport. a hotline between Tehran and Jerusalem, in my judgment, would be a good thing. But that would cause Jerusalem to acknowledge that Tehran has the right to exist, that the Iranians have the right to defend their country, that the Iranians have interests that should be respected. The Israelis don't like that word diplomacy any more than the people running our government today, who are much like the Israelis, have no use for the word diplomacy. And again, debt doesn't seem to matter until it does. When it does, then I'm sure all of this will collapse. But right now, it hasn't mattered yet. And until it matters, we will continue to splurge money in every conceivable direction on whatever project Washington wants to undertake. And right now, that project is essentially making war with Israel against its enemies. Although there are people that have expressed reservations, and yes, the president has said we won't join an attack on Iran. But again, how do you stay out? That's the question. How do you avoid being entangled ultimately if it happens? I don't see how we do.
I don't either. Yeah.
And by the way, the same thing is true for the Russians. How do they stay out? They are on very good terms with the Iranians. They've made it very clear they will not allow us to destroy the country. If you look at the Russians and their positions in the region, they're shadowing our vessels. They have a lot of military power at sea, not just surface ships, but submarines. They have more forces now in Syria than they did previously. The opportunity for this to widen to include Russia is real and should be in everybody's mind, where it probably isn't, but it should be.
Last thing I want to ask you about here, Doug, is there was.
By the way, there's something that you may not be aware of, but there have been talks for some time between the Israelis and the Azeris in Azerbaijan about the use of airfields in the Caucasus that belong to Azerbaijan that could be staging areas for Israeli strikes against Iran. I think the Azeris are probably going to come to some sort of arrangement because the Israelis have provided the Azeris with capabilities that they used against the Armenians successfully. So this thing is already widening.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that is something that bothers Mr. Putin in Moscow. I'm sure that he would like the Azerbaijanis to back out of this. I don't know what's going to happen, but there are too many critical points now where the tension and the heat is up. And so it wouldn't take a great deal to trigger this regional war we keep talking about. And that's why what the Israelis do next is so important.
And Doug, I want to look in one last question here about the impact this is having on the United States. There's already been information out that we spent about $1.5 billion in helping Israel repulse this relatively small level of attack here. And if this continues on, if it gets into a war, what is the risk that we run out of the kinds of interceptor missiles or artillery shells or all these things that we keep giving to both Israel and to Ukraine? I mean, we have a limited number of some of these things. J.D. Vance published a piece last week or so talking specifically about our limitations in producing PAC-3 missiles for the Patriot air defense systems. And if we get into an actual sustained war, I don't know that our ships and our planes and everything else can continue to fire these missiles off at that rate.
Well, remember that it's sort of a rule of thumb that you fire 2 or 3 of our air defense missiles at any incoming target. So you can go through our entire inventory in a matter of a few days. So I think Senator Vance's concern is very legitimate. Again, there isn't any thinking here. Everything is impulse driven. There is no strategy. What is your strategy? The United States has very clear interests. We're interested in regional stability and prosperity because that's the key to our own prosperity. The last thing that we want is to see a war. However, we have a government that's gone out of its way to promote war in Eastern Europe, and I think now will promote war in the Middle East. In Eastern Europe, we're very fortunate that we have not come to blows with the Russians directly, because the Russians are now mobilized. They've got the manufacturing base operating at a very high rate. They can produce whatever they need for as long as they need to do it. We found out that this abundance of resources in Russia makes a difference. The question is, are we going to risk this kind of conflict in the Middle East and involve ourselves directly when we cannot be certain of victory? And frankly, if you can't be certain that you will win, you shouldn't engage in it at all. Certainly give yourself at least an 80% probability of success.
Right.
And see, this is what General Keane is promising in a vacuum. He's saying, just looking at Iran and the United States, we can obliterate Iran. I think we can obliterate it. We're not going to get away with it without sustaining serious damage ourselves. We haven't even talked about what's happening inside the United States and the potential for problems here in our own hemisphere. But having said that, he's looking at everything in very simplistic terms. He's not looking at the larger strategic picture that involves Russia, that involves China. China is preparing to invest heavily in Iran right now. The Chinese are not going to sit quietly by and let us destroy Iran either. That doesn't mean the Chinese will attack us, but it does mean that the Chinese will provide whatever is required by Iran and Russia in a conflict that involves us. We are not a free agent that wanders aimlessly and strikes wherever it likes without consequences and implications.
Yeah.
But that's what he's painting as a picture. Oh, don't worry about this. We can bully our way through these people. There's nothing we can do, and it'll stop them from their pernicious activities,
It's still 1991 in their view. We're the unipolar moment,
Yes.
and that no one else can do anything. And we're not there anymore. But they keep acting like we are.
Yeah, and look at the state of the Navy. Not good. The United States Navy has serious problems. We don't need to go into all the ships that have to return to port to reload, and then look at the locations for the missiles and where they are and how they can get more of them, and sustaining ships at sea for long periods. People think, a ship goes to sea, it sails around for 8 or 9 months and it comes home. No, it has to be provisioned wherever it goes. It has to be routinely provisioned. And if you're in a war, that's no small matter. It's not just ammunition. It's also water and food. And how do you get it to them if they're trying to evade destruction in an all-out war? None of this makes any sense. We're not prepared for this. We haven't thought it through. We need to stop. So what we need right now is diplomacy. We need someone who steps in and says, wait a minute, we don't want a war, and we're going to make damn sure it doesn't happen. And this is what we want to do. And I know some people will say, well, that's ridiculous. You put in a hotline between Tehran and Jerusalem. What difference will that make? Well, it may make a difference, because at least you've got people on either end of the line talking to each other. And if they're talking to each other, they may not be killing each other. And that's a good thing. So I think that's a good first step. And I think we should emulate what the Chinese and the Vietnamese have done. We should see that happen elsewhere. But of course, you and I are interested in stability and peace because it's good for prosperity. We're the minority voices. We're not the brave, dynamic figures on the Hill and in Washington who've never seen war, who've never been shot at, who've never killed anybody in combat. They have a cocktail level of familiarity with real war, and they don't believe it can ever reach us. They're the ones pushing this nonsense.
They are. And for all our viewers out here, that's one of the reasons why we're such an advocate of our country, our choice, because you bring up the possibility for injecting sanity into the thought here. The big problem that I think we have, that you've talked about several times throughout this whole episode here, is that there is no strategic vision in the United States. And this, frankly, it goes to both the Republican and the Democratic side here. It's just the elite, really, no matter what letter that you want to put after their name. And that's why we're telling people, go to our country, our choice. Now, you mentioned a second ago, Doug, there's some things we're not going to get into here. That's a context for home, but you're starting some broadcasts here, as I understand, and you got some that are coming up here. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about what people can tune in and see?
Well, we're beginning to put together what we hope will be a weekly program that'll last 45 to 60 minutes, where we're going to try and take on some of the more salient issues with guests. You've been with us we're going to have you again. We're going to try to bring in experts. And this week, we're talking to someone who has done a great deal of work on election integrity. And this person, and I don't want to mention the name, I think it'll be an interesting surprise for people, has been involved with litigation, at least 4 major lawsuits in various states, and has made the argument that if the information we have now, the evidence that has surfaced and is beyond dispute, were available earlier, the last election in 2020 would have gone differently. And I think we know we have an election integrity problem. So we're going to talk about that. Judge Napolitano is going to be on tonight, and Vandersteel, also talking to our guest and asking the questions and exploring this matter. And then we're going to talk about this whole issue of war, because no one, Dan, ever asks whether or not the American people have been consulted.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, what if you took a poll tomorrow or the next day and asked, is everyone ready for a regional war that could reach the coasts of the United States, reach into our territorial waters, reach into our country, could involve people that have already marched into our country with millions of other illegals? Are you prepared for this? And of course, you know what kind of an answer you're going to get. Of course not. No.
Right.
But we don't ask those questions. What we say is, do you support Israel? Of course I support Israel. That doesn't mean I want to go to war with Iran.
Exactly.
And this doesn't mean I think it would be good for the Israelis to do that. In fact, I think it would be catastrophic. I still do. And I think Jack Keane is very wrong. And I hope that Mr. Netanyahu and his cabinet, as angry and emotional as they obviously are going to think about this. This is, taking this position, it's either our way or the highway, is a bad one. That's not how diplomacy works. Finding some sort of interim solution, even if it's interim, that postpones stupidity, is still better than eagerly jumping on stupidity.
Well, I can't end on anything better than that. That's I think we need to put that up on the headlines there soon. But Doug, thanks so much for coming on today. As always, we're grateful for your insights here, and we recommend everybody go to Our Country, Our Choice and check out his site there and be a part of that army that they're trying to put together for American values and American benefits and all those kinds of things, Doug. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan.
And thank you guys very much for joining. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our channel here, because, folks, we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you all the things that you need to make sense of your world around here. Ground truth reality. That's what we live for. Thanks very much. We've got some other good episodes coming up later this afternoon that you're not going to want to miss with Jason. We've had him several times before. Tune in this afternoon, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.